Some people love us deeply, but they rush to fix our sadness before they have heard the whole story. Paul always thought loving his wife meant solving whatever was wrong, until one rainy evening, he found Helen sitting alone in her car, right in their own driveway. The engine was off. The lights in the house were on, but she still had not gone inside. "Hello, my friend. Thank you for coming back and sitting with me today. I don't know if you have ever been in a conversation like this. Someone you love is trying to tell you something. A difficult day, something at work, a sadness they cannot quite explain, a heavy feeling in their chest that they do not know how to name. And because you love them, you want to help right away. You want to tell them what to do. You want to give advice. You want to solve the problem. You want to make things lighter as quickly as you can. That is not a bad thing. Sometimes that is love too. But there are moments when the person in front of us does not need an answer, not a plan, not a solution. Sometimes they only need someone to sit beside them and ask slowly, "Do you want to tell me more?" Today I want to tell you about a man named Paul Henderson. Paul loved his wife. He had never doubted that. But after more than 30 years of marriage, Paul began to understand that loving someone is not always knowing what to fix. Sometimes it is knowing how to sit still long enough to hear what they have not finished saying. Paul Henderson was 62 years old. He lived with his wife, Helen, in a small house outside Cincinnati, Ohio. They had been married for 34 years. Not a perfect marriage. No, so marriage is, but a steady one. A house they had paid for together. 2 grown children who had moved out. Many winters shoveling snow side by side. Many summers cutting the grass. Many arguments that ended with dinner at the same table. Many mornings when they no longer needed to ask how the other took their coffee. Paul had worked as an electrician for most of his life. He was the kind of man who saw something broken and wanted to fix it. A loose outlet, a porch light flickering, a cabinet door that squeaked, a dryer making a strange sound. Paul did not like broken things to sit around for long. Helen used to joke, "If I sigh too loudly, you'll probably ask me where the wiring needs replacing." Paul would laugh, "I just want to know what's wrong." Helen would say, "I know," and she did know. Paul was a responsible husband. He filled Helen's gas tank when he noticed it getting low. He scraped ice off her windshield on cold mornings. He fixed the kitchen drawer before Helen had a chance to complain about it. He replaced the porch light as soon as it started blinking. Paul loved through action. He believed that if he could make Helen's life a little easier, then he was loving her well. And for many years, Helen appreciated that. But as she got older, Helen began to realize that some things inside her could not be fixed with a screwdriver, an appointment, or a quick piece of advice. Some days, she did not need Paul to fix anything. She only wanted him to listen. Helen was 60. She worked part-time in the library at a local elementary school. She liked the work. She liked the smell of paper books. She liked helping a second-grade boy find the dinosaur book he had been asking for all week. She liked repairing the spine of an old picture book. She liked watching children sit still for a few minutes because a story had caught them. But the work tired her too. Not in a dramatic way, just in small ways that gathered throughout the day. A difficult parent, a child crying because someone had teased her, a teacher asking for one more favor just as Helen was getting ready to leave, an email she had not answered yet, a call from their daughter, Megan, saying their grandson had a fever, an insurance bill arriving on the same day. Helen was trying not to worry about money. Each thing was small, but many small things can make a person feel heavy. In the evenings, Helen often wanted to tell Paul about her day, not to complain, only to set part of the day down somewhere. She would say, "Something happened at the library today." Paul would look up right away. "What happened?" Helen would begin. But often, before she had finished, Paul had already started looking for a solution. "If that parent was rude, you should talk to the principal." Or, "Don't take extra work if they're not paying you for extra hours." Or, "You need to tell Megan you can't watch Caleb every time she asks." Or, "Maybe you should cut back another day." Paul did not say these things harshly. He said them because he wanted to help. But after many years, Helen began to feel that she was being moved to the conclusion before she had finished the story, as if she had opened a small door inside herself, and Paul had walked in carrying a toolbox. One evening after dinner, Helen said, "I felt a little sad today." Paul was washing dishes. He turned around immediately. "Why? Did someone say something?" Not exactly." "At school?" "Not really." "Is it Megan? I told you she needs to handle more on her own." Helen went quiet. Paul turned off the water. "That's not it." Helen shook her head. "It's nothing." Paul looked at her. "If you don't tell me, I don't know how to help." Helen gave him a small smile. "I know." Then she stood up and began wiping the table. Paul thought the conversation was over. But really, a small door had just closed. Not loudly, not angrily, just closed. And in a marriage, many doors do not slam. They close little by little, so quietly that the other person does not hear them. That November, Helen began sitting in her car a little longer before coming into the house. Not every day, just now and then. She would drive home from school, pull into the driveway, turn off the engine, and sit there, her hands resting on the steering wheel, her purse on the passenger seat, the gray evening light falling across the windshield. Inside the house, Paul might be making dinner, or watching the news, or fixing something near the kitchen. At first he did not notice. The first time Helen sat for about 5 minutes, the next time 10. Then, one Thursday evening, when the air was cold and a light rain had started to fall, Helen sat there for almost 20 minutes. Paul looked out the kitchen window and saw her car in the driveway, but the door had not opened. He wiped his hands on a towel, watched for another moment, then put on his coat and went outside. The rain was thin and quiet. He tapped gently on the driver's side window. Helen startled and turned toward him. Paul opened the door. "You okay?" Helen looked at him. "I'm okay." "What are you doing out here?" "It's cold." She looked down at her hands. "I just needed a minute." "You've been out here almost 20 minutes. Helen gave a small smile, but the smile did not reach her eyes. "Then maybe I needed more than a minute." Paul did not know what to say. His first instinct was to ask what had happened. Who upset her? Who needed to be called? What needed to be handled? What he needed to do right now? He almost asked, "Who made you upset?" But this time, seeing Helen sitting there in the gray light, he stopped. Something about the way she sat made him slow down. She did not look like a person who needed a plan. She looked like someone who had held herself together all day and needed a little silence before walking into the house. Paul asked more softly, "Can I sit with you?" Helen looked at him, surprised. Then she nodded. Paul walked around the car, opened the passenger door, and sat down. The engine was off. The car was quiet. Rain touched the windshield in small drops. They sat beside each other in their own driveway. For a few seconds, neither of them spoke. Then Paul, still not used to that kind of silence, asked, "Was it something at school?" Helen looked straight ahead. "Yes, but not exactly." Paul nodded. He wanted to ask more. He wanted to make the problem clear, so he could know what to do. But he held himself back. After a while, Helen said, "There was a little girl crying in the library today. She said she didn't want to go home because her parents were fighting again." Paul turned toward her. Helen continued, "I sat with her for a while. I didn't know what to say, so I just sat there." She swallowed. "Then I thought, isn't that strange?" "What is?" "Sometimes a child knows exactly what she needs." Paul waited. Helen said, "She didn't need me to fix her parents. She just needed me to sit with her until she could breathe normally again." Paul looked at her. Helen gave a sad little smile. Adults don't always know how to say they need that too. Something in Paul's chest tightened. Helen did not look at him. She only said very quietly, "Some days I don't need you to fix anything, Paul." The words landed softly, but Paul heard them clearly. He wanted to say, "I'm not trying to fix you." But then he remembered so many evenings. Helen beginning to tell him something, him interrupting with advice. Helen saying, "Never mind, it's nothing." Him thinking everything was fine. Now, sitting in the cold car outside their own home, Paul suddenly understood that maybe for many years he had loved his wife by trying to make her pain end quickly, when what Helen needed was for him to stay in the story a little longer. Paul looked down at his hands. Those hands had fixed many things in his life: outlets, breakers, lights, doors, the little pipe under the sink, the porch roof after a bad storm. But those same hands did not know what to do with a sadness that had no screw to tighten. He said quietly, "I'm sorry." Helen turned toward him. "For what?" Paul answered slowly. "For always jumping to the fixing part." Helen looked at him for a little while. Then she said, "I know you're trying to help. Yeah. But sometimes when you help too fast, it feels like what I'm saying doesn't get to stay in the room long enough." Paul heard that. It did not hurt like blame. It hurt like truth. He nodded. Rain kept touching the glass. After a while, Paul asked, "So, what do you want me to do?" Helen looked at him, almost smiled, and Paul realized he had just asked another problem-solving question. He shook his head. "No, let me try again." Helen waited. Paul spoke more slowly. "Do you want to tell me more?" Helen looked at him. This time, her eyes softened. "Yes." Paul sat still. "I'm listening." Those two words sounded simple, but for Paul, they were not easy. To truly listen, he had to stop preparing an answer in his head. He had to stop looking for the broken place. He had to sit beside the sadness of someone he loved, without rushing to make it disappear. Helen began to talk about the little girl in the library, about a tired teacher, about how she felt a little older when she had to bend down to pick up books from the floor, about Megan calling to ask if Helen could watch Caleb one more day, and how Helen wanted to help, but she was tired too, about how she sometimes missed the years when the children were small, even though back then she had also wished they would grow up a little faster. The things Helen said did not form one clear problem. There was nothing Paul could fix in 15 minutes. It was only life, many small threads tangled together. Paul listened. A few times, he wanted to say something. He wanted to give advice, to say Megan needed to figure out her own schedule, to say Helen should work one less day at the library, to say the little girl should talk to the school counselor. But each time, he looked at Helen's hands resting on the steering wheel, and he held the words back. By the time Helen finished, the evening had grown darker. The porch light had come on. Paul asked, "Do you want to go inside?" Helen let out a breath. "Yes." Then she looked at him. "Thank you for not fixing anything." Paul gave a soft laugh. "That was harder than I thought." Helen laughed too. "I know." They went inside. Dinner was a little cold. The news was still playing on the television. Nothing big had changed in the house, but something small had been placed back where it belonged. After that night, Paul did not become a perfect listener. No one changes a lifetime of habit after one conversation in a car. There were still times when Helen told him something, and he could feel advice rushing toward his mouth. One evening, Helen said Megan had called again, asking if they could watch Caleb on Friday. Paul almost said, "You need to tell her that." Then he stopped. Helen looked at him. Paul set his fork down. "Sorry, I'm fixing again." Helen smiled, a little fast. Paul took a breath, then asked, "Do you want to tell me more?" Helen looked at him for a moment, then nodded. "Yes." Slowly, a new sentence began to appear in their house. Not, "What do you want me to do?" but, "Do you want to tell me more?" Some evenings, Helen only needed 5 minutes. Other evenings, she needed longer. Paul learned to put his phone down, to lower the volume on the television, to not stand up and start washing dishes while Helen was still talking, to not look at the clock too soon. At first, it felt awkward. Sitting still without fixing anything made him feel as if he was not helping. But then he began to notice something. Sometimes Helen got up from the table looking lighter, even though Paul had given no advice. Sometimes she smiled again sooner. Sometimes she simply said, "Thank you for listening." And Paul began to understand that listening was also a kind of care. It did not sound like a drill. No screw was tightened. Nothing on the wall looked newer afterward. But someone in the house felt less alone. And that was a kind of repair too. A very quiet kind. One evening in December, their daughter Megan brought Caleb over. Caleb was 5 years old, running around the living room with a toy fire truck. Megan sat at the kitchen table, looking tired. Helen made tea for her daughter. Paul was fixing a stuck drawer near the stove. He heard Megan say, "Mom, I feel like such a bad mother." Helen sat beside her. "Why do you say that?" Megan let out a breath. "I lost my patience with Caleb this morning. He spilled cereal everywhere, and I snapped at him. Then he cried. I know he's just a kid, but I'm so tired." Paul was holding a screwdriver. He almost turned around and said, "You need more sleep." Or, "Kids spill cereal. Don't beat yourself up." Or, "Maybe Caleb can help clean next time." But then he looked at Helen. She did not rush in. She did not explain. She simply placed her hand over Megan's and asked, "Do you want to tell me what happened this morning?" Megan looked at her mother, then began to talk. Paul stood by the drawer, screwdriver in hand, and for the first time, he really heard the way Helen listened. She did not interrupt. She did not turn the story into a lesson. She did not make it bigger than it was. She simply gave Megan a safe place to set down a hard morning. A few minutes later, Caleb ran into the kitchen. "Grandpa, my truck broke." Paul looked down. One wheel had come off the toy fire truck. Finally, something he knew how to fix right away. He smiled. "Bring it here." Caleb handed him the truck. Paul sat on the floor and reattached the little wheel. While he did, Megan kept talking to Helen, and Paul realized that the kitchen held two kinds of love at the same time. A mother listening to her daughter, a grandfather fixing a toy truck. Neither one was better. They were simply needed at different moments. When Paul finished, Caleb shouted, "Thanks, Grandpa." Paul said, "You're all set." Then he looked over at Helen. She was looking at him with a small smile. No words were needed. Paul understood. Sometimes the wheel needs fixing, and sometimes the person just needs someone to sit with them. The important thing is knowing the difference. A few weeks later, Paul and Helen were sitting in the living room on a cold evening. Outside the window, snow had started to fall. Helen was knitting a small scarf for Caleb. Paul was sitting in his armchair, reading instructions for replacing the furnace filter. Helen suddenly said, "Paul, yeah, I miss my mother today." Helen's mother had been gone nearly 10 years. It was not the anniversary, not her birthday, just an ordinary day when an old song had played in the grocery store and brought her mother back to mind. In the past, Paul might have said, "Do you want to call your sister?" Or, "I can take you to the cemetery tomorrow." Those were not bad things to say. But this time, Paul set the instructions down. He looked at Helen, then asked, "What do you miss about her today?" Helen stopped knitting. That question opened a very small door. She told him about her mother, about hands that always smelled faintly of flour, about the way she hummed while washing dishes, about the blue sweater she wore every Christmas, about one morning when Helen was 12 and her mother brushed her hair before school picture day. Paul did not say much. He only listened. When Helen cried a little, he did not tell her not to cry. He did not say she should think happy thoughts. He did not jump up immediately to get tissues, as if tears were a problem to solve. He simply moved closer. After a while, Helen rested her head on his shoulder. "Thank you," Paul said. "I'm learning." Helen smiled through her tears. "I know." He looked out at the snow, then said, "I wish I had learned sooner." Helen took his hand. "You're learning now." That made Paul quiet, because at 62, people sometimes think they are too old to learn a new way of loving. But maybe, as long as the person is still sitting beside us, it is not too late. Spring came slowly. The snow melted. The grass in the backyard began to turn green again. One afternoon, Paul was fixing the porch light. When Helen came home, she pulled into the driveway, turned off the engine, and sat there. Paul saw her from the small ladder. In the past, he would have worried. He would have climbed down right away and asked, "What happened?" But this time, he did not rush. He climbed down, set his tools aside, went into the kitchen and made 2 cups of tea, then carried them outside. He opened the passenger door, sat down beside Helen, and handed her a cup. Helen looked at him, surprised. "You knew?" Paul placed his cup in his hands. "I guessed you needed a minute." Helen smiled. "Maybe more than a minute." Paul nodded. "I've got time." They sat in the car. No rain, no snow, only spring light falling gently across the dashboard. After a while, Helen said, "A little boy at the library asked me today why grown-ups are always in a hurry." Paul looked at her. "What did you tell him?" Helen smiled softly. "I told him, I'm still trying to understand that too." Paul smiled. Then he asked, "Do you want to tell me more?" Helen looked at him. This time her eyes were very soft. "Yes." Paul leaned back in the passenger seat. "I'm listening." And in that car, parked right in front of their home, two people who had lived together for more than 30 years found another way to be close. Not through a big trip, not through a gift, not through a promise that everything would be perfect from then on. Only through a cup of tea, a seat beside someone, and a man who had finally learned that love does not always need to fix something right away. Sometimes, love only needs to ask, "Do you want to tell me more?" and then stay long enough to hear the answer. You know, I think there are many people like Paul, not because they do not care, but because they care in the way they know how. They hear sadness and want to make it lighter. They hear a problem and want to find the answer. They see someone they love tired, and everything in them wants to fix something quickly. That can be love too. But sometimes, the person we love does not need to be pulled out of their feelings too soon. They need us to sit with them there for a while, not rushing to explain, not rushing to advise, not rushing to turn their story into something that needs to be handled. Just listening. Listening as if what they are saying has permission to remain in the room for a little while. Listening as if the person in front of us matters more than the answer we are preparing. Maybe that is what Paul learned. That listening is not doing nothing. It is a very gentle action. It says, "I am not afraid of your tiredness. You do not have to become cheerful for me right away. I will not leave just because I do not know how to fix this." And maybe, in many long relationships, what slowly creates distance is not always one big wound. Sometimes it is many small moments when one person was not finished speaking and the other had already answered. Many moments when someone wanted to be understood but only received a solution. Many moments when a small story could not find a place to land. But the beautiful thing is, if we are still here, we can still learn. Even at 60, even after 30 years together, even after living in the old pattern for a long time, one small question can open a door again. Do you want to tell me more? I'm listening. If today's story made you think of your husband, your wife, your partner, or someone in your life who has been trying to tell you something, I hope you hold that feeling gently, not as blame, not as shame. We all rush sometimes. We all have moments when we love someone, but do not know what they need in that moment. We all have times when we think we are helping, when what the other person really needs is to be heard a little longer. But if there is still a chance today, maybe it can begin with something very small. Put the phone down, lower the television, look at the person a little longer, and instead of asking, "What do you want me to do?" maybe ask, "Do you want to tell me more?" Then stay. Thank you for sitting with me today. I truly appreciate it. I wish peace for you and for the people you love. Until our next story, take good care of yourself. And if someone in your life is trying to say something, I hope today you can hear them, not only to answer, but to understand. This is Companion, stories that remind us what truly matters.